There are moments in life that don't announce themselves with noise or spectacle, no grand signal, no external validation. Just a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the structure of things. And yet, beneath that quiet surface, something fundamental has realigned. You didn't necessarily become someone new overnight, but your relationship with reality, your posture toward responsibility, toward chaos, toward your own potential, has altered in a way that is deeply consequential. What's remarkable is that while you were wrestling with doubt, carrying burdens that felt unfair, trying to impose order where there was none, the very conditions that once constrained you began to reorganize themselves in your favor. Not because the world suddenly became kind, but because you became someone capable of confronting it properly. And the unsettling part, perhaps even the dangerous part, is that others didn't see it coming. They're still operating under outdated assumptions about who you are, what you can endure, what you're willing to do. But something has shifted, and that shift has weight. It changes the game in ways that are not immediately visible, but undeniably real. It's a strange thing to come to terms with. The realization that the most significant transformations in your life rarely begin where anyone can see them. They don't start with applause, or recognition, or even visible success. They begin in places that are much quieter, much more uncomfortable, and often deeply private. The shift you're experiencing didn't originate in your circumstances, and it certainly didn't wait for permission from the outside world. It began in the way you started to think, in the way you chose to interpret your struggles, and in the decision, perhaps a reluctant one at first, to stop turning away from what demanded your attention. Because, fundamentally, what changes a person is not what happens to them, but how they decide to engage with what happens to them. And that's not a trivial distinction. It means that long before anything around you began to reorganize itself, you were already undergoing a restructuring at a much deeper level. You were learning, perhaps painfully, that avoidance compounds chaos, and that the act of confronting even the smallest piece of disorder in your life begins to tilt things in a different direction. That's not a dramatic process. It doesn't feel like victory. In fact, it often feels like unnecessary effort, like you're carrying more than you should have to carry. But that's precisely where the shift begins. You start by doing something simple, almost insignificant. Taking responsibility for something you previously ignored, telling the truth when it would have been easier not to, holding yourself to a standard that no one else is enforcing. And at first, it doesn't seem to matter. The world doesn't reward you immediately for that. There's no instant feedback that confirms you're on the right path. But what is happening subtly and persistently is that you're reorganizing your internal structure. You're becoming more aligned, less fragmented, more capable of directing your own actions rather than being pushed around by impulse or fear. And that internal alignment has consequences. It changes the way you perceive opportunities, the way you respond to pressure, the way you carry yourself in situations that used to destabilize you. But here's the critical point. None of that is visible to people who are only paying attention to outcomes. From the outside, it may look like nothing has changed at all. They still see the same person, operating in the same environment, dealing with the same limitations. What they don't see is the shift in orientation, the fact that you're no longer approaching those limitations in the same way. You're not waiting in the same way. You're not hesitating in the same way. You're not interpreting setbacks as final in the same way. And that difference, while subtle at first, accumulates. It builds pressure beneath the surface. It creates a kind of internal momentum that doesn't rely on external validation to continue. And over time, That momentum begins to express itself in ways that appear sudden to others, even though they are anything but sudden. So when things start to move in your favor, when opportunities appear or obstacles begin to dissolve, it can look like a coincidence or luck to anyone observing from a distance. But what they're actually seeing is the delayed effect of a process that started much earlier, in a place they couldn't access. The shift was real, but it didn't announce itself. It didn't need to. It was already reshaping everything from the inside out, long before the external world had any choice but to reflect it. There's a point, often reached after repeated failure, frustration, or the quiet accumulation of unrealized potential, where something becomes intolerable. Not in a dramatic sense, not in a way that demands attention from others, but in a deeply personal and almost unsettling realization that you can no longer justify standing still. It's not that you suddenly become fearless or extraordinarily confident. It's that the cost of remaining where you are begins to outweigh the fear of moving forward. And in that moment, something critical shifts. You stop negotiating with yourself. Because prior to that, much of what holds you back is not a lack of ability, but a series of internal bargains you continuously make. You tell yourself that you'll act later, that conditions aren't right yet, that you need more time, more clarity, more certainty. And those justifications can be incredibly persuasive because they often contain fragments of truth. But they also serve as a shield, one that protects you from the immediate discomfort of action, while quietly ensuring that nothing fundamentally changes. It's a dangerous equilibrium because it allows you to feel as though you're progressing, when in reality, you're merely postponing the confrontation with your own potential. Stopping that negotiation is not a comfortable process. In fact, it often feels like you're stripping away something that once kept you stable. You're no longer allowing yourself the luxury of endless deliberation or the illusion that you can wait for the perfect moment. You begin to recognize that the right time is not something that arrives fully formed from the outside, but something that is created through decisive engagement. And that realization carries weight, because it places responsibility squarely on you. It means that when you know what needs to be done, whether it's difficult, tedious, or uncertain, you don't retreat into rationalization. You don't soften the demand or reinterpret it to make it more convenient. You act, even when the action feels insufficient or imperfect. And that's where the transformation begins to accelerate, because you're no longer dividing your energy between intention and avoidance. You're directing it forward, consistently, without the constant internal resistance that once drained your capacity. There's a certain clarity that emerges when negotiation ends. Decisions become simpler, not because the path is easier, but because you've removed the option of escape. You're no longer asking whether you feel like doing something, or whether you're in the right mood, or whether the outcome is guaranteed. Those questions lose their relevance. What remains is the recognition that action itself is the necessary condition for change, and that your potential is not something abstract or distant, but something that must be expressed through what you do repeatedly, especially when it's inconvenient. And from the outside, this might look like discipline, or even sudden determination. But internally, it's something more structured than that. It's the establishment of a principle that you are no longer willing to betray your own capacity through hesitation. And once that principle is in place, it begins to organize your behavior in a way that is difficult to reverse. You start to notice that the same situations that once triggered delay or doubt now lead to immediate engagement. The friction that used to slow you down is reduced, not because the tasks are easier, but because you've eliminated the internal argument that made them feel optional. This doesn't make you immune to difficulty. You still encounter resistance, uncertainty, and moments of doubt. But those moments no longer dictate your actions in the same way. They exist, but they don't control you. And that distinction is what makes the difference between potential that remains theoretical and potential that begins to manifest in tangible, measurable. There's a profound difference between knowing what you should do and actually doing it at the precise moment it matters. Most people live in that gap, suspended between intention and action, where hesitation quietly erodes their effectiveness. It's not that they lack awareness. In fact, they often know exactly what is required of them. But when the critical moment arrives, when action must be taken without delay, something intervenes. Doubt creeps in, alternatives begin to multiply, and what should have been a straightforward response becomes unnecessarily complicated. That hesitation, even when it lasts only seconds, has consequences. It fragments your ability to act decisively, and over time, it conditions you to mistrust your own judgment. What changes, however, is not the complexity of the situations you face, but your relationship to those moments of decision. There comes a point where hesitation is no longer perceived as harmless. You begin to see it for what it is, a form of avoidance disguised as careful thinking. And that recognition is not entirely comfortable, because it forces you to confront the ways in which you've been undermining yourself. Not through dramatic failure, but through subtle delays, through the consistent refusal to move when movement is required. Replacing that hesitation with discipline is not about becoming rigid or mechanical. It's about establishing a framework within which action takes precedence over doubt. Discipline, in this sense, is not merely a habit. It's a commitment to act in alignment with what you already know to be necessary, regardless of how you feel in the moment. And that's where the transformation becomes significant, because it eliminates the dependency on motivation. You're no longer waiting to feel ready, or confident, or certain. You're acting because the situation demands it, and because you've trained yourself to respond accordingly. In critical moments, this shift becomes immediately apparent. Where you once paused, you now move. Where you once second-guessed, you now execute. And that doesn't mean your actions are perfect. In fact, they often aren't. But they are timely, and that timeliness carries its own form of precision. Because in many situations, especially those that involve pressure or uncertainty, the cost of inaction far exceeds the cost of imperfect action. You begin to understand that clarity often follows movement, not the other way around. This doesn't happen overnight. It's built through repetition, through the consistent choice to act even when it's uncomfortable, even when the outcome is unclear. Each time you override hesitation, you reinforce a different pattern. One where action becomes the default response rather than the exception. And over time, that pattern solidifies into something reliable. You start to trust yourself, not because you believe you'll always make the right decision, but because you know you won't remain stuck in indecision. There's also a psychological shift that accompanies this change. The anxiety that once surrounded critical moments begins to diminish, not because those moments become less significant, but because you've reduced the uncertainty about how you will respond. You've removed the internal debate that used to precede every important action. And in doing so, you free up cognitive energy that was previously consumed by overthinking. That energy can now be directed toward execution, toward adjustment, toward learning in real time. From the outside, this might look like confidence or even instinct, but internally, it's structured. It's the result of a deliberate process where you've conditioned yourself to prioritize action over hesitation, especially when it matters most. And that consistency begins to compound. It influences how others perceive you, how opportunities present themselves, and how effectively you can navigate complex situations without becoming overwhelmed by them. One of the more disorienting aspects of personal transformation is the realization that while you have changed in ways that are meaningful and deeply structured, the people around you often have not updated their perception of you accordingly. They continue to interact with an image of you that was formed at a different time, under different conditions. An image that may have been accurate once, but is now increasingly misaligned with who you are becoming. And that discrepancy creates a kind of tension, not necessarily overt or confrontational, but persistent. It shows up in subtle ways, in lowered expectations, in dismissive assumptions, in the quiet disbelief that you are capable of more than you previously demonstrated. This happens because most people rely heavily on past evidence to predict future behavior. It's a practical strategy, and under normal circumstances, it works well enough. But it also means that when someone begins to change internally, when they restructure their habits, their values, their standards, that change is not immediately visible to others. There is a lag between who you were and who you are becoming, and during that lag, you are often misunderstood. You are evaluated based on outdated data, as though your past limitations are still in full effect. And if you're not careful, that perception can become a constraint. Not because it is accurate, but because it is repeated. When people consistently treat you as though you are still the same person, it can create pressure to conform to that expectation. It's subtle, but powerful. You may find yourself hesitating in ways that mirror your past behavior, not because you are incapable of acting differently, but because the environment around you is reinforcing an older version of your identity. That's where the challenge becomes psychological as much as practical, because to move forward, you have to hold a position that is not yet fully recognized by others. You have to act in accordance with who you are becoming, even when that version of you is not acknowledged, or worse, quietly doubted. And that requires a certain level of internal stability. You can't rely on external validation to confirm your progress, because it will arrive late if it arrives at all. Instead, you have to orient yourself toward a standard that exists independently of how others perceive you. There's also something else happening beneath the surface. While others are still operating under their previous assumptions, they are not preparing for the consequences of your change. They are interacting with you as though the same patterns will repeat, the same limitations will apply, the same outcomes will occur. And when those expectations are violated, when you respond differently, act more decisively, or refuse to engage in the same dynamics, it disrupts their model of you. That disruption can be uncomfortable for them, because it forces a reassessment they were not anticipating. But that reassessment doesn't happen instantly. People tend to resist updating their beliefs, especially when those beliefs have been reinforced over time. So there is a period where your actions and their expectations are out of sync, and during that period, you may encounter skepticism, subtle resistance, or even attempts to pull you back into familiar patterns. Not necessarily out of malice, but out of inertia. It's easier to assume that people remain the same than to continuously adjust your understanding of them. So the responsibility falls back on you, not to convince others through argument or explanation, but to demonstrate consistency over time. Because perception eventually follows pattern, but only after the pattern is undeniable. And until that point is reached, you are operating in a space where your current capabilities are underestimated. That can be frustrating, but it also creates a kind of advantage. You are not being fully accounted for, not being fully anticipated, and that means your actions carry an element of unpredictability that can work in your favor if you remain aligned with the changes you've made internally